we're gonna get right into it. I will say, just to give a few elements of reflection to the audience, I think it is kind of ironic that we're sitting in one of the chicest neighborhoods of the capital. The vast majority of us, I think, are probably English speakers, native English speakers from abroad, talking about gentrification. So hopefully part of the conversation tonight will be whether or not all of us, or at least the majority of us in this room, are participating unwittingly to the process that that Cole describes. So we'll start, Cole. Your book certainly suggests an ideal vision of what Paris should be, what it's looked like in the past, elements of that survive today, and elements that you think are worth preserving. So can you maybe read a passage from your book that you think illustrates that ideal vision that you have of the city?
Yeah, I think this will be good just to kind of give a sense of the book, or at least it's some sense of the book. Let me just check this. I think it's this one right here, so it's not too long. Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of different chapters in here. This was a chapter about Belleville, and I see at least one person here who I interviewed in the book who knows very well the neighborhood. So this is a chapter about Belleville and the sort of melting pot that the neighborhood is, and sort of what's at stake. I think sort of one of the reasons why why I decided to write this book. All right, so I'll read. One of the essential ingredients of the Parisian melting pot, as imperfect as it always was, as flawed as it is today, has been affordable housing. It's not the only reason Belleville became Belleville, but it was an essential precondition. Without cheap housing, the neighborhood would never have welcomed in so many immigrants in the early half of the 20th century. It would not have been the destination of choice for North Africans in the 1960s and 1970s. It would not have attracted immigrants from Wenzhou from the 1980s onward. Affordable housing is also the lifeblood of other lesser-known immigrant-inhabited micro-neighborhoods spread across the city, places where new arrivals with little cash can set down roots. It's why there's another Chinatown in the 13th arrondissement, Chinatown in quotes, in the southern edges of the city, near the boulevard périphérique and the Porte de Choisy. Predating Belleville's Chinatown by a couple of decades, the area also counts a large share of immigrants from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the former colonial holdings of French Indochina. Affordable housing is why there's a large Tamil-speaking population from Sri Lanka that can be found around La Chapelle, in a small stretch between the Gare du Nord train station and the La Chapelle metro stop, with a handful of shops extending upward into the southern reaches of the 18th arrondissement. It's why there are stores advertising elaborate saris and Bollywood DVDs, and it's why the first Hindu temple in France, the Temple Ganesh, can be found here, hidden inside a nondescript apartment building. Affordable housing is why there's the even smaller Serbian micro-neighborhood around the Rue du Simplon on the 18th, right near the much larger West African hub at Château Rouge. The long track record of foreign people setting down roots, launching businesses, and mixing with existing influences, the creation of that hybrid culture that's sometimes more Parisian than French, has long hinged on the ability to find lodging that is not prohibitively expensive. But what happens when you pull that fundamental element out of the equation? The damage can only be measured over time. Maybe Belleville will resemble something like Manhattan's Little Italy or the Lower East Side, museumified versions of working-class immigrant neighborhoods where one can visit a couple of landmark businesses to feel a whiff of the past and remind oneself that ordinary people used to live there. Maybe with enough time, Belleville will look like the Marais, a place where you can reflect on the fact that there's still a lot of history if you manage to tune out the armies of tourists and shoppers. Or maybe it'll be closer to Brixton in South London, a place where a few older immigrant-run businesses hold the line against the homogenized coffee shops and wine stores. Fortunately, Belleville isn't quite at any of these levels yet, and neither is much of the northeast of the city. But deprived of its core ingredient, the melting pot of Paris is under duress, and the brutality of the changes can be hard to overstate. Many of its residents are leaving, its balances are out of whack, its soul is being sucked out in real time. A little dark there at the end, but it's not only dark, the book, but I think that just to kind of set the tone, I think it's a helpful passage, maybe.
For sure. So your ideal Paris is one that is that above all has affordable housing and is diverse. It sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, when I was, writing about this project and writing about the problem of gentrification. I think that when you start tackling that question, it makes you think about sort of what the ideal neighborhood is. What's the ideal of the city, and some of that I think depends on personal choice and aesthetic preferences to some extent. I didn't want to get into discussion of my own architectural tastes or whatever, writing the book. But what I wanted to show is that there's a part of the city that where ordinary people can afford to set down roots, where people historically have been able to do that. And I think it's really important, for the character of a city, that ordinary people can live there, that immigrants can come, that young people can come, that they can experiment, that they have, the ability to create things without having to worry about, rent too much and how expensive, rent can be. So I think there's two different points here, but I think the sort of melting pot that I'm describing here, what I think this passage is trying to show is that, this melting pot, and maybe it's obvious, but I think it's really important to insist upon this point, hinges on housing being affordable. And so I think it's such neighborhoods are built on so many different factors. Housing, isn't the only thing. Affordable housing isn't the only ingredient. But what I'm trying to suggest is if you remove that ingredient, you can really mess up the character of a neighborhood, and beyond that, it's unfortunate that people have to leave the places that they want to stay in. If they do want to stay. So I think that's one way of getting at the question. Maybe we can get into it more later. But I think certainly I think it's an important point. Without elaborating, without repeating it too much. It's this connection between the melting pot and affordable housing.
I asked you about the ideal, your ideal, which I know is a difficult question to answer because an ideal vision of a city is subjective. But you talked about affordable housing, diversity. Is there a time in the past, because the second part of your book does talk about the history of Paris, the ghosts of Paris that shaped the city that we've come to know today. Is there a time in the past in your research and preparing for this book where that Paris that you see as ideal was representative of the very bones of the city, was the most defining characteristic of Paris? Has that ever existed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's three parts of the book. One is reporting in the present day. The chapter I just read from is the present. There's a second section on the past, and then a look at ahead about what we can do to keep the city affordable. But yes, certainly in that second part of the book, which I get into, is looking at the history. And yes, for a very long period of time, Paris was a working class city. And part of that is still around today. And again, just to be more precise, so that I'm not just kind of saying these words that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Working class, if you look at the French socio-professional classification system, the French in France historically, the way I've translated working class in English comes from the two categories in French that are ouvrier and employé, which are basically manual workers, ouvrier. And then employés are more, it's kind of hard to translate, but service workers, roughly speaking, I think is one way to think about it. And so if you look at just the number of ouvriers and employés in Paris, it's shrunk considerably. As recently as just after the Second World War, you had a majority of the city that was ouvrier and employé well into, a few decades after World War II even. So this was, and that really, shaped the character of the city. So I think, just to be a little bit more precise, we've seen this decline in people that are blue-collar workers, service workers living within Paris. It's very concrete. And I look at even before that in the book, Paris is a place where this the lower, let's say, there's a lot of words that were used to describe this, sort of the have-nots, I guess, in Paris. They were the populace, the canaille, the masses. A lot of different kind of ways of thinking about this. The classe laborieuse, the laboring classes. But this was a section of the population that had a tremendous amount of influence in the city. You can look over the course of the 19th century, in these various revolts. Starting with the French Revolution, obviously, the long 19th century, as the historian Eric Hobsbawm likes to call it, or refer to it as. Sorry, what was I saying? Yes, about the long 19th century. Yes, so you have this these sort of these myriad revolts over the course of the long 19th century, where this part of the population is fighting for their right to belong in the city, combining both these sort of abstract political goals, but also with very concrete material demands and the ability to have ownership over their neighborhoods. And so I think it's interesting the way that this sort of battle over space in Paris comes up and it influences the course of French history. There's the French Revolution. There's a number of revolts in 1830 and 1848, and then of course the Paris Commune of 1871. And then maybe just one last thing I'll add on. I know we're covering so much ground historically, but I think it's another point I'll just insist upon here when we think about sort of the benefits of affordable housing. One of the strands that I try to get out in the book as well in the subsequent chapter is this other image that we have of Paris. Well, it's really not just an image, but Paris being the sort of global mecca for the arts. That really comes the sort of high point, I think, is really right after World War I, with the start of the Surrealists, going until in the 20th century, going until let's say New Wave cinema in the late 50s. If you look at sort of this era of Paris, it's interesting to look at the housing costs also at this time. Paris was extremely, extremely cheap to live in, and I don't think that point is really sufficiently understood. If you just look at the numbers. There was a minister right after the Second World War, when the French state was trying to rebuild itself after the Second World War, trying to deal with the often shoddy housing and the fact that they needed to invest and rebuild. And what they found was that because of rent controls that had been in place, that French people in 1948 were spending more on tobacco than they were on rent. Which is a pretty stunning statistic. I think it's really hard for us to kind of wrap our minds around just how cheap of a city this was, And I think that, what does that mean when you have a city where you can not have to worry about spending money on rent? Okay, maybe the buildings are not in a great, place, and you can see the character of the city too, And I don't want to idealize it too much. You can see the state of the buildings. It's dirty, the living conditions were not often great. People, had shared bathrooms, until really quite recently even, but certainly in that area, in that period of time. But it was a place that, if you were interested in pursuing your craft and pursuing, what you wanted to do, you could live there. And then there's a whole, I don't want to, go on for too long, but there's a whole list of artists that were able to benefit from this. Many of them American, as well. Well, we'll talk about the American Library. Someone like James Baldwin, for instance, who came to Paris in 1948, I believe. Who had like $40 when he came to Paris and could find housing in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which is the center of the kind of literary world. And James Baldwin shows up and was able to find a place. And again, the conditions were not great. Okay. But you could do that, at that time. And of course, I'm talking about art now, but keep in mind also, this is a time when Paris was, a working class city again in the French kind of sociological sense of ouvriers employés, so blue collar workers and service sector workers. So it's a city where you have artists that can live, and it's a city where working class people can still live in the city. That just to give you kind of a picture of kind of post-war Paris, when the city was still extremely affordable.
Even though the standard of living perhaps wasn't obviously what we know today.
The housing standards, yeah. And
but we will get to that, to get to that later, because I do want to talk about the word gentrification. It's a loaded word. It's kind of like woke. It means everything and nothing at the same time. Is it simply rich people buying property and pushing poor people out? Is there a racial element to it? Is it white people replacing neighborhoods where people of color have lived? How do you define it for the purposes of your book? Is it as a sociological? Do you see it as a sociological concept, a cultural one, and a geographical one, or economic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think it's fundamentally we're talking about an economic process that's reshaping urban housing markets. And so maybe people here already know about the literature of gentrification, but just to kind of give more background on sort of where the word comes from, And it's interesting because in French, they didn't usually really use this word until quite recently. People in France would often talk about embourgeoisement, so the bourgeoisification of cities. But we're seeing more of the word gentrification in French as well. In any case, so it's a word that gets, coined, so to speak, in 1964. Ruth Glass has a famous article where she's talking about sort of this process that's reshaping parts of London, historically working class neighborhoods, and she talks about a process that goes on until the original inhabitants are forced to leave. She only uses the word once in the essay, but that was 1964. There's a theorist who I think has shaped a lot of the literature around gentrification today, whose name is Neil Smith, who's a Scottish geographer who studied under David Harvey, if anyone knows who that is. So it's under the kind of Marxist tradition. And what Neil Smith is talking about is a process that's reshaping the land, and a structural process, excuse me, it's an important word to use. We talk about Marxist geographers. Structural process affecting land and housing markets. And so what it is, according to Smith, according to this paper that he wrote in 1979, and then elaborated this over the course of his career, we're talking about just an economic process in which, under capitalism, the system that we all live under, housing, like the power of labor, is a commodity. And so it's something that investors will invest in to make a profit, and it becomes a commodity like other commodities under capitalism. Because of that, you have this process that's in some ways ingrained into urban housing markets when you have demand for real estate. And so Neil Smith, what he talks about is, not to get too much in the weeds here, but his thing is the rent gaps is what he talks about. So it sounds kind of complicated, but it's a very simple idea. The rent gaps is the idea that it's the difference between what the existing person is paying on a plot of land versus what a presumptive landowner can think that they can charge for the price of land. So it's the idea basically of identifying, if you're a developer saying, well, there's this neighborhood right here, people are paying so much so in rent. I think it can be, this set at this level. So it's this idea that when you have this, according to Neil Smith, you have this rent gap that sort of facilitates or sort of encourages the process. But I think it's a fundamental part of how cities work, unfortunately, under capitalism. It doesn't mean that it can't be slowed down, or frozen, stopped, reversed, but it means that if you don't do anything, this is a process that is part of the way that, urban housing markets work under capitalism. Just to add a little bit more nuance to it, without getting too much in the weeds, there's another researcher, Philip Clay in the US, who talks about different stages of gentrification. I think it's a good way to think about it too, so that we can distinguish, what's happening in, let's say, Belleville from here. We're kind of off the map in the 7th arrondissement, but like the Marais, for instance, or like when you think about Marseille, in downtown Marseille, we're at kind of early stages of gentrification. He talks about 4 phases. And then there's another book recently that came out a few years ago, P. Moskowitz, who says, well, maybe we should have a 5th stage of gentrification. And maybe that could apply to, I don't know, the 7th arrondissement or parts of Manhattan, where it's like even the luxury, I don't know, handbag store that just, has moved in is getting pushed out because, I don't know, another business that's even more expensive has come in. So even when wealthy people are getting pushed out. So it's a process. It's a dynamic process. It's part of the way that housing markets work under capitalism, and there's different stages of it. Just to add a little bit more nuance. That's the way that I conceive of it. It doesn't mean, again, that it's inevitable and that it can't be stopped, but it means that if you don't do anything about it, again, when there's demand in a housing market, then it's going to run its course. And frankly, we see a lot of that in the United States, where the state has such limited regulatory power and, frankly, political will. And so, you see the effects of, look at a place like San Francisco or New York. It's really tragic, honestly, what's happened. Even I'll talk about New York because I know New York better, but having these cities that used to have so much, dynamism and character and kind of weird people moving in and having the ability to just pursue what they want, and working people and all of them getting pushed out. And San Francisco is not a place that I frankly would like to, it's kind of sad what it's turned into. And I don't want Paris to turn into that. And I think just to step back again, unlike the US, in France we have tools. The state has a lot of tools to address the problem. And some of them are already in place right now in Paris.
We are going to talk about those tools, but before we get to that, I want to talk about the kind of economic definition that you laid out, one where the relentless pursuit of profit kind of dictates real estate acquisitions and all of the changes culturally that come with that. So do you see gentrification as inevitable in the capitalist economic system? And if so, given the fact that none of the Western democracies that everyone in this room are familiar with look to be going in any direction other than capitalism, are any measures to try to combat the process futile?
No, definitely not. I mean, so I'll just jump right in then to sort of what's being done. There's a lot of different aspects to this book. There's the sort of reportage about these neighborhoods that in the beginning. There's also there's history and there's a big policy chunk, and it kind of depends. I hope I don't kind of nerd out too much in the policy in one of these chapters, but I'll
favorite chapter.
I'll do that. I guess now. I mean, there's a lot of different tools, and I think maybe one of the hopes that I'd have with this is that people certainly in the U.S. where we have such a culture of not intervening, could see, hey, we have interesting. The French state has some interesting tools. Okay, so I think one of the biggest ways you can deal with gentrification, one of the best ways to slow down the process, is if you have this process that's sweeping in, that's ingrained into capitalism, if you basically take out a big chunk of what the real estate speculators, the developers, the wealthy foreign investors, what they can access. If you basically take it out of their hands, then there's nothing they can do about it. And so in France, we call that social housing. And so it's the idea that you have not just the idea, it exists. It's state regulated, state managed housing, and what that does is essentially takes that that chunk of housing stock out of the hands, or out of the potentially out of the hands of the the little real estate piranhas, as one of the activists called them, the little sharks that go around looking for their prey. Jean-Baptiste Ayrault, who's a sort of legendary housing activist who I spoke to for the book. Okay, so social housing is one way of doing that. Social housing in Paris is in place, and when I spoke with Yann Brossard, who's the deputy housing mayor of Paris, who I interview in this book, what he says, and part of it is he's defending his record, but he says, yes, okay, gentrification is happening. Yes, it's not good. Working class people are leaving the city, but what you have to ask is, what would it look like if we didn't have all this social housing? Which, okay, he's defending his record, but I think it's a fair point. Paris, when the socialists took control of the city in the early 2000s, 2001, I think it was around 13% social housing. Today, we're around 22, 23%. And France actually has a law that large cities have to have 25% social housing by 2025. Paris says that they're going to reach 30% by 2030. I think this is the most simple, effective way of combating gentrification. More social housing, and you look at a neighborhood like Belleville, social housing is around 40%. So that sort of melting pot, in a lot of these neighborhoods, in the 19th arrondissement, the northeast of the city that I'm sort of trying to celebrate in the book, you have massive share of the housing stock is social housing, and that's what's keeping these neighborhoods alive. So social housing is a huge thing, maybe the most important. Then for the rest of the housing that's not under public hands, you can put rent controls in place. And France, they've gone back and forth. Again, that there was a long period I was talking about from 1914 to the end of the Second World War, where you had super low, strict rent controls in France. That was changed, and they were gone they were moved in the 1980s. To make the story short, more recently, cities can put into place rent controls. Paris is doing that right now. That's another good tool. It's not the only tool. So I know, it's a particularly it's a big source of debate in the U.S. This idea around rent controls, because it does have a tightening effect on the housing supply. But if you have a more broader strategy where you're doing social housing and some other measures I'll talk about, rent controls can be quite effective. The problem today in Paris is that the rent controls are maybe set too high, and the city doesn't set them. It's also the national government that sets them. So social housing, rent controls, and then I'll just kind of tackle this last thing in one fell swoop. But one of the big challenges of Paris is, it's a city where you can't build a lot of new apartments. Okay, so typically, and this is the way we talk about affordable housing in the U.S. a lot, is you have this kind of YIMBY-NIMBY divide, which we can the yes in my backyard versus the not in my backyard, and I there's maybe some logic to that, I think, in the U.S., but I have a lot of problems with just opposing these two ways of thinking about housing, because there's obviously other tools. It's not just building and not building. It's who's owning the apartments that you're building, who owns the land. So that's not to say that yes. Okay, so let me take a step back. It's important to build, to have more housing available. That can also have an effect on prices. The problem is in Paris, you can't really build because there's quite literally not enough space. There's very little space available in the city. So it means, the challenge is how do you kind of how do you create more housing supply when you can't build, okay? There's there's around 19,000 vacant apartments in Paris that have been vacant for more than 2 years. 19,000, it's quite a lot. So there's this one tool that housing activists, like the guy I was mentioning, Jean-Baptiste Ayrault from Droit au Logement, the kind of main housing rights organization in France, they call on the state to use this sort of tool that they have from the World War II era, which is the right to requisition. The national government can take over unoccupied buildings as long as they compensate the property owner. So they say, we have homeless people in Paris, we have working class people that are fleeing, we have migrants that are coming, they can't afford, they're sleeping on the streets. We have 19,000 apartments, a lot of them in the wealthier bourgeois parts of the city, not too far from here in the central parts of Paris. Why don't we just use our right to requisition? You can crack down on Airbnb, another way of sort of getting at the housing supply. And France has laws that allow that. Paris limits it to 120 days you can rent on Airbnb. Frankly, why not make that lower? Airbnb, I think, has a really corrosive effect on cities. We see it a lot in Marseille. I don't want to just only go after Airbnb, but do we really need Airbnb in the city? We have plenty of hotels. I don't know.
Airbnb brings to mind another interesting element about gentrification to me. I feel like paradoxically there are parts of gentrification where the interests of the rich and poor kind of converge. It's not always something that opposes the interests of the rich and poor, and I feel like gentrification embodies that in the same way that renters are opposed to an increasing offer of Airbnb apartments because it diminishes the offer that they have available to rent. Wealthy people also don't necessarily want to see their neighborhoods become museums flooded with tourists. Is that something, because I know the government passed that Airbnb limit recently, do you think that there's a hierarchy in that sense in the way that the French government manages gentrification, and that they're more likely to prioritize elements of it where everyone essentially has an interest in it being combated, as opposed to things that really just affect working classes or immigrants?
Sorry, if you could maybe reform it, because I'm not totally sure that I followed
I wonder if Airbnb is interesting to me precisely because I feel like people are quite unanimous about how, what they think should be done about it. I feel that there are very few people, at least in Paris, if not in any cities, where there's a desire for more Airbnbs. And so I feel that it's almost easier for the government to combat those forms of gentrification because people are so unanimous about it than it is to combat things that only affect working classes, poorer populations, or immigrants.
I agree with you there. Yeah, totally. I mean, in some ways, what you're saying is that it's a fairly easy step to take. Yeah, exactly. The political costs are not too high, and it's relatively easy. But just to thinking about what you just said about even just the way that gentrification can kind of upset the dynamics of neighborhoods. I was speaking, I won't single them out too much here, but someone who's in the audience, speaking with them in Belleville, who lives in a neighborhood that was historically working class, that some is still is to some extent today in the Sainte-Marthe neighborhood, who I interview in the book, who bought their apartment at a very low cost because they wanted a place to live. I'm forgetting the exact year, but for a while ago, bought their apartment, and now is a property owner, which in some sense, great. And I spoke to their friends as well. It's not just this one person in the room, but a group of them. So they're property owners in this nice neighborhood in right next to Belleville. But it's small apartments. And I talked to someone, so it's small apartments, but they come from a certain kind of sociological background. And what do they see around them and the other people that are moving in? It's not people like them. They're not welcome in certain businesses. So they're seeing the character of the neighborhood change. And I think this is a great way also of thinking. It's a quote that kind of struck me, speaking with one of these women who said, my friends say, well, why don't you just leave Paris? You could make, a fortune selling your apartment. It'd be great. And then, and her response is like, well, why would I want to leave Paris? Like, I want to live in Paris. Why should I have to leave the city? Which I think gets back to the fundamental question of the book, which is sort of kind of what I get at towards the end, is that people have the right to live in the neighborhoods that they come from, that they want to stay in, and we need to make sure that's possible through the political tools that we have. And I think in a lot of ways, like, it's good to think about cities as not subject to housing markets as just subject to these powerful economic forces that we can't control, that are just dictating everything. Housing is only about supply and demand and interest rates, and banks extending loans and sort of the economy. And there's something you can do about it. It's sort of natural. Cities are extremely political. The constructions of cities and who gets to live in cities and what neighborhoods look like are the results it's a result of politics and political battles. And so for a lot of the history of Paris, the balance was, let's say, closer to the have-nots, the laboring classes, the working class. Today the balance has shifted in the other direction, but it doesn't mean that you can't reshift it. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. There's a whole other kind of spot this thing we haven't talked about, which is the suburbs, but in the banlieue. But
that's what I wanted to get to now, because in the same way that many of the revolutions that you explore in the second part of your book were led by neighborhoods that were technically located outside of what was defined as Paris at the time. I'm thinking about the Commune. I'm thinking obviously about the 1789 revolution. Given that, what nature do you think the suburbs of Paris today, the peripheral zones of Paris, have to play in shaping the Paris of the future, especially as the city looks towards expanding into the Grand Paris?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes honestly writing this book, I felt like, in some ways I could have wanted to write more about the banlieue. There's one of the chapters. There's 6 chapters. The last one's about the suburbs. This book is about a certain kind of Paris that still is around, that hasn't been killed off yet, but it's still around. It's different in a lot of ways from much of the sort of northeastern suburbs. But the reality today is that in Paris, this is a metropolitan area defined by INSEE, the statistics agency. There's 12 million people living in the Paris metropolitan area, and there's just over 2 million living in Paris. Okay, so you have 9 million people living in the Paris suburbs. The majority of working class people in the Paris region live in the suburbs, and everywhere. But if you want to just to simplify for the sake of the discussion, if you look at maps and the sort of structure, it's tends to be the north and northeastern neighborhoods. Are especially, let's say, working class, the Seine-Saint-Denis department. And so that's a lot of working class people live there today. So I think I sort of get it in the last chapter, but I think there are people in the suburbs also deserve to have a city that suits them, that meets their basic needs, and I think that's a good way of also kind of talking about how to deal with gentrification as a political problem. I think the best way of combating it, of dealing with gentrification, articulating a political response, is to talk about this question of what people neighborhoods matching people's needs. What do people deserve to have in their neighborhoods? Public services, good street life, if possible, transit options, education, these sort of basic services. And
but is that linked to gentrification? Because that doesn't, having those things can coexist with a city being gentrified.
No, yes. That's a good point. And what I'm saying is that I think this is the good way to articulate, articulate a political response to this problem of gentrification. Because it's true that, and I thought about this as well, and I've kind of shifted the question, but speaking with, I'm thinking of an essay that a friend of mine, Colin Kinneberg, wrote in Dissent, which talks about the difficulties of the gentrification framing for articulating for what it means for how do we articulate a political response if we use this framing of gentrification? Because one way of there's sort of a trap, I guess, which is of saying, okay, gentrification is bad. What we want is not invest. We don't want investment in urban areas because it raises property values. That's not good either. It's foolish to oppose investment as a whole because it means that property values will increase. I think it's foolish and it's cruel also to people saying you don't deserve to have a certain kind of a cafe or restaurant. And I think, when we think about the suburbs of Paris, again, to bring in the Philip Clay framing of these different stages, we're at different stages of gentrification that are lower than in Paris. But I think, the way of addressing that is to not say we're against investment at all costs, but is to say we want neighborhoods that meet our needs. We want to have transit options. We want to have housing that's affordable. We want to have parks. And so I think that's a good way of sort of articulating a response to it. But for dealing with this issue in the suburbs. But I think also to get back to more politically of what's happening. Yeah, I mean we've seen there were riots, revolts. It depends on what term you use. You can use both of them. But this summer, taking place in the Paris suburbs, linked to racism and police violence. A couple years before that, in 2021, in the spring of 2021, we saw the sort of French expression of Black Lives Matter that was linked to the George Floyd killing, but also had very French characteristics, led by Comité Adama, and sparked by the killing of Adama Traoré a few years before in the Paris suburbs at the hands of the police. So you had these two big social movements that originated. They're very different. One is more organized protest. One was more of a generalized revolt, riot. But you have these sort of uprisings that are coming from the periphery of the Paris area, certainly, and we see that today. The question is, how do you? It's maybe beyond the bounds of this book, but having a sort of political coalition that's bringing these people together in order to put into place the policies to make the whole region affordable. But that's kind of beyond the bounds of the book. I hinted at in the conclusion.
I think it does, because you did mention some of the protests that we've seen in the suburbs. And in one of the chapters, the founder of the prominent housing rights organization, DAL, compares mobilization against various elements of gentrification in places like Berlin to mobilization in Paris. And he says what's missing in the French capital precisely, or even in the French suburbs, is presence at protests, involvement from people in neighborhoods that are concerned about what's happening on a larger scale. This is one of the big ironies about gentrification in Paris to me, because it's a city that's known for its revolutionary fervor, and that you see elements of in the suburbs today, but it feels like there's a lack of unity in terms of what people are asking for. The protests in the suburbs tend to involve protesters from the suburbs, whereas the protests in Paris tend to involve Parisians. So why do you think that there's less resistance, less unified protest against the way that the city is changing here?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good question. I think there's two things I think that you were kind of hinting at there. One is, okay, why is there not? It's true. There's not a huge housing movement historically, really today in France. Certainly compared to other questions, there's something that the DAL, the group Droit au Logement, Right to Housing, talks about. You have moments, and I get into it in the book, but France does not have a super well organized sort of housing movement. Not comparable to sort of what we see in Spain or Germany. I wish we had activists to talk to kind of get into that, but it's I think an important point. on that. And then the second point on the lack of unity. Yeah, I mean, there's a big sociological, economic, cultural, racial, although we don't, that's a difficult word to use in France, divide between the working class northeastern suburbs and of Paris and the in much of the city of Paris, but also in the political left in France. You don't have nearly as, I was recently I was speaking with Daniel Obono, who's a deputy member of the National Assembly with La France Insoumise. Daniel Obono, who for a long time was for years was I think the only black member of La France Insoumise in the National Assembly. There are others today, and so even that party, which is portraying its which is the most prominent left-wing party in France that claims to speak on behalf of working class people in the suburbs, and who these people also vote for, I should say as well. If you look at the maps, even they have problems. They're not totally representative of these populations that they claim to represent. And so there's a lot of work to be done, I think, and Daniel Obono would agree as well, along with others in La France Insoumise. That was just one example of one party, but we see this elsewhere on the French left as well.
I don't know how much time we have until we have to turn it over to the audience. One more question. Okay. So then, before I just kind of want to open up the discussion, because one of the people that you interviewed in, I think, chapter 6 of your book got me thinking about how we can move the conversation about gentrification forward. In chapter 5, Rabia, who's a man that's been living in a 9 square meter apartment in the 19th arrondissement for the past 8 years, says, "It's a shame the moment where the neighborhood starts to get nicer is the moment that we have to leave." And you say, and you nod, and you think to yourself, well, that's exactly the point. People like you are not supposed to be here anymore. And it made me wonder, does combating gentrification in a certain sense rely on social immobility? Conversations about it that kind of imply that there will always be and should always be a certain working class that doesn't have the same amount of access to luxury goods in a major city. So on top of obviously combating some of the elements of gentrification that you talk about in your book, should we also not just be doing more to help elevate the purchasing power of people in general, a better redistribution of wealth, fighting for increased salaries, because at the end of the day, most people probably do want the same things, which is to live in the nicer neighborhoods of Paris, including the Bobos today who live in Barbès and tell you they love living in Barbès.
I think you're going to have to define Bobo for the audience, Erin.
How true that is.
I think does everyone, we have new Parisians here that might not know the word Bobo, but I think maybe we got it, yeah. No, I mean, okay, that was a very good question, and I basically, I think I agree with you, but I think, yeah, so okay, at the very end of the book, and I'll answer this very quickly, the goal isn't, I'm not just saying, let's just carve out a space for working class people to live in this deeply unequal, hostile city, in a hostile, overall economic situation and a difficult political climate. Obviously this is the goal of in order to achieve the goals that I'm talking about in the book, the ones that activists are fighting for, you're going to need a bigger, political shift that's going to address some of the issues that I think you're talking about. It's hard to imagine some of these changes taking place in the political moment that we're in today with Emmanuel Macron as the president, and this sort of stranglehold that his party has right now on the National Assembly. These are changes that are not going to happen right away. And they're changes that would be accompanied by bigger, political and social upheaval that I don't think is really outside the realm of possibility in France today.
Can we have a round of applause, please? We're going to open the discussion up to questions now from our audience in person and on Zoom. If you have questions, feel free to send them in, and we'll bring the microphone over. We'll start right here.
Hi, I was a housing activist in the United States, so I know a little bit about what happens in Europe. But my understanding is that in Vienna, they have developed an extremely strong social housing program that came out of the government's been going for 30 or 40 years, and basically everybody can afford to live there. Is that the kind of model that we should be seeing in places like Paris?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I forgot to mention Vienna when I'm trying to but you're right. I think Vienna is a good model to look at. I mentioned it in the book as well. Paris is what you could say, like half the way there. If we're talking about 30% social housing by 2030, Vienna is around 60%, if I'm not mistaken, social housing. Vienna is a great example of social housing working, and it's the model that a lot of people talk about. In the U.S., I think I was reading about a delegation. I remember it was either from DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, or from members of Congress, I think, that were in Vienna. I think it was actually members of Congress.
They had a big conference in Washington, D.C. right before COVID hit. So
Yeah.
the idea never really developed in the United States. It struck me that it might be further around here in Paris where there are more regulations, stronger government for people who are terrified by the idea of regulation.
Yeah, no, I think Paris is sort of we see the positive effects of social housing, and so you have a lot of gentrification, but you also have this sort of protection that's insulating some people, but not nearly enough. So it's sort of this kind of in between state. It's not like Vienna. But just one other point about the U.S. as well. I think Seattle, the city of Seattle, recently passed a referendum to create a social housing developer. And it's funny because they passed a referendum and it was sort of like, figure it out, they passed this. And so now the developer is starting the process, so it's sort of early. But I think it's very interesting that's a concrete example of, I was looking at the coverage of that, and they're clearly looking at Europe for answers. So that's interesting to look at as well in the U.S. and Seattle. Yeah. I unfortunately don't know the city that well, but but yeah, I believe you. Yeah, certainly.
Are there other questions in the room? Yes.
Hi. So this is clearly a very heavily researched, reported book. I'm wondering, what surprised you the most in the research or reporting process? Things that either kind of upended notions people hold about Paris or about gentrification, or both?
Oh man, that's a great question, Jess. I think, I think really the final chapter, which is dealing with the suburbs, and when I was speaking with someone who just graduated from high school, who started their university studies, who lives in La Courneuve, and they were talking about, they knew why the book was about gentrification, but I was interviewing them about sort of their experience growing up in La Courneuve, what it was like just in the high school. La Courneuve is in the northeast suburbs, a lot of huge immigrant population, very working class. So I was asking them sort of what it was like. And we met at this one cafe in La Courneuve, which is sort of like the one, the way that he portrayed it is kind of the one kind of like Parisian style cafe, because people in La Courneuve don't really go out a lot. There's not really a vibrant street life really at all. It's a lot of big public housing towers. The downtown is very small. And we got to talking even after the interview just about this question of gentrification. And so when you think about like a place like La Courneuve, it got me thinking, because he was saying, is it fair to say that people here don't deserve to have a nice kind of bobo-looking cafe in La Courneuve? It's true. What you say that people don't have they can't have a nice little Parisian bobo cafe? Because if you're saying you're against that's some evidence of gentrification, and it's true. It kind of made me it sort of challenged some of my not my assumptions, but just kind of the framework. Made me think more about sort of, okay, we're talking about a dynamic process in different stages, and then we think about the political response as well. How do you deal with this political problem? You don't say, we're not going to invest in your neighborhood because it means that property values are going to increase. You say, how do we think of the neighborhood as a place where we're meeting your basic needs? So in some ways, yeah, it kind of, bousculer was in French, it kind of shook me a little bit, but made me kind of rethink my vision and ultimately I think helps solidify it or make it stronger in any case. Yeah.
We have time for one last question. Yes, you're right here.
Thanks. I'm wondering if anything came out in your research, or just if you have any thoughts on the role of urban form in gentrification. Paris is a city that is actually like remarkably dense as compared to most cities around the world, and certainly to North American cities. But there are height restrictions here. There's a really rich historic fabric that obviously none of us would want to see go away. At the same time, that can have a suppressing role on, you can play it can suppress the housing market. So, is that something that the city ought to address in your mind, or is that something that kind of large-scale regional projects like Grand Paris can actually, just through transportation, help address while leaving the core kind of intact as it is?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question that I think, Paris is extremely dense, and it's sort of, I think, I hinted at it very briefly, but this issue of, it's hard to really hike up the housing supply by building in Paris, like, unless, yes, if you say, let's knock down some, Haussmann era buildings and put up giant towers. I don't think that's a desirable option. I don't think a lot of people in Paris want that. But the other thing to keep in mind is Paris is so small. It's a very, very small city. And it means that, just geographically, it takes up a very little space compared to other cities. It has the same population as Houston, Texas, but 1/15 the size of Houston, Texas. So to answer your question, I think what it means is that you have to develop the suburbs in an equitable way to make the suburbs more dense and to have that be part of the solution. I think it's not a very desirable outcome to be knocking down the architecture in Paris to just build new buildings. Yeah.
Can we have a final round of applause, please?